Can I jump in and ask a specific question about some of that? So I'll just come clean and say that I'm an organizer with the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. But do you think that there's a role for, specifically around U.S. Jews' support for Zionism, the charge of anti-Semitism that's coming against the Palestine Solidarity Movement? Can you say what you see as a potential U.S., like the potential role for U.S. Jews in this movement?
U.S. Jews have a lot of different positions. I don't think there's a U.S. Jewish community that can take a view. I mean, probably the majority of U.S. Jews of your age, what Israel's doing is just inconsistent with their ordinary liberal values. Okay, I mean, I don't think most of them care about Israel. Okay, it's just, what they're doing, not the kind of thing we can accept. So for them, there's not much point arguing about Zionism or non-Zionism, and it isn't even clear what you're arguing about. What's Zionism? I mean, like in the 1940s, I was a Zionist youth organizer opposed to a Jewish state. That was part of the Zionist movement. Okay, Zionism has changed a lot, but so it's kind of like an abstract discussion. I mean, look, Israel's there, There's a lot of rotten states in the world. Most of them are much worse than Israel. In fact, the ones right in the neighborhood are much worse. Like, say, Saudi Arabia, much worse than Iran. It's much worse than Israel. Egypt's much worse than any of them. So to say, okay, we're against Israel, it just opens you up to the charge of hypocrisy. I mean, why not Egypt? Why not Saudi Arabia?
Even as Jews?
Jews, look, if you don't, there is a view that Israel, the official line in Israel, court decisions, is it's the state of the Jewish people. Well, do you accept that? I don't. It's not my state. They say it's the state of the Jewish people, meaning my state, but not that of its Palestinian citizens. Okay, I'm against that. And since I'm against that, it doesn't matter if I'm a U.S. Jew or not in regard to activities toward. It's to say, look, what should U.S. Jews do is to accept the Israeli position. And I don't think we ought to do that. We say, look, it's a state, okay, good things, bad things, I'm against the bad things. You can say, like I would say, that I don't really think the state ought to exist, but I can say that about a lot of states. For example, should the U.S. exist sitting on half of Mexico? No, I don't think so. But I'm not going to say, okay, let's destroy the United States. I mean, you've got to work within the world as it exists. And I think, you can argue that, as I would, in fact, that I think it's better for all the inhabitants of the former Palestine if they ultimately get towards a settlement which breaks state lines. I think they're all better off. Okay, I can say that, but it's for them to work out. Like you can say, I think in Afghanistan and Pakistan, I do think there ought to be a Pashtunistan, okay, which would cross the artificial border that the British imposed there, which is not causing all kind of problems. Fine, but it's like you can talk about that like in this room, but it's not a policy. The policy is, should we send more troops? Actually, a friend of mine who's an Australian intelligence officer described all this pretty well. I thought, he said, look, it's kind of like a chess game. I mean, suppose you see two people playing chess, and one of them asks you for advice. Well, you can come and say, mate the king. Yeah, but that's not advice. The advice has to be, what do you do about that pawn? You can keep mating the king in the background, but you want to know how you get there, And a lot of the proposals that come from the groups that call themselves anti-Zionists are like mate the king. Like when you say, I think there ought to be one state. Okay, maybe let's mate the king. But what are the steps that you take towards that? And I can't think of any proposal that doesn't go through a two-state solution, which I don't like. But I can't think of any other proposal, and I never heard of another one. So whatever the mate the king proposal is, you can keep in the back of your mind and can kind of help you think through what you ought to be doing next. But you have to be asking, what can we do now? And I think there are a lot of things we can do now that might lead to mating the king. But So I'm not convinced that I think for Jews like us, we should be careful, I think, not to accept the Israeli doctrine that it's our state. And if it's not my state, which I don't think it is, although they claim it is, then my attitude towards them is the same as towards Egypt.
Does the same principle apply when we were talking about earlier about what works and what doesn't, and what's what's responsible and what's not? When looking at the other two of the BDS, there's academic boycotts, cultural boycotts, or sanctions.
Depends on the case. I mean, take the academic. Personally, I was never in favor of academic boycotts in South Africa either. I don't think it was the right thing to do. I mean, it was okay on narrow things, like a boycott against, say, racist hiring practices. Yeah, that made a lot of sense. In fact, that was done in the 60s already. Say, okay, we're going to boycott universities that won't hire blacks or won't let black students in. Fine. In the case of Israel, if, say, Bar Ilan has facilities on the West Bank, okay, it makes sense to boycott them. But, take, say, Tel Aviv University. I mean, yeah, they're involved in oppression in the West Bank. MIT is involved in oppression all over the world, but I don't think it makes sense to boycott MIT. So we should take a position which works if it's generally valid. And some things are. Like if MIT had facilities in the West Bank, I'd say, yeah, it's a good reason to boycott them. But if MIT is creating technology that's going to be used to, destroy the world, which maybe it is, I don't think that's a reason to boycott it.
Same thing with sanctions, international sanctions.
I mean, my feeling is they should meet one condition that any tactic has to meet is you don't give weapons to the enemy. And one weapon you can give to the enemy is to be hypocritical. So any tactic you think of, you have to ask, look, is it justified generally? Like, is it justified against me? Okay, that's one tactic. And then you have to ask, well, what is educating people? It seems to me the education that has to be carried out here is to break the illusion that the United States is some kind of honest broker that's trying to bring peace to the world and so on. That's perfect nonsense. So you want to break that. And that means focus on what the U.S. is doing and a lot of things it's doing. Like, for example, it's sending arms to Israel, which is illegal under U.S. law. Okay, let's focus on that. And in fact, you could even think of court cases. You won't win them, but they can get publicity. Why shouldn't these be charged for breaking U.S. law? Or Caterpillar, or Lockheed Martin, anybody else. But even that has to be cautious. Like, there's a lot of high-tech industry that invests in Israel. Now, if it's in Israel proper, like Intel, then it doesn't make sense to boycott it unless you're willing to boycott Intel when it has facilities in the United States, which has a much worse record than Israel does. So I think all those considerations always have to be kept in mind. And it is tempting to use tactics that make you feel good, but you have to ask what are the consequences, and especially the consequences for the victims. It's got to be paramount. And the fact that, say, some society asks you to do something, that doesn't tell you anything. I mean, there are a lot of there are arguments here saying, look, Palestinians want us to do something, in solidarity we have to do it. That doesn't make sense. I mean, people under attack can make wrong decisions for themselves, and you don't want to help them in wrong decisions.